So I'm going to post to the ENDI wiki right now. Thank you very much. I'm going to post to the ENDI wiki some evidence that I was just going to display up here.
Goodbye, children.
We'll just sort of go with that.
I got really bored. My favorite picture was a donut with speech. She couldn't even joke. And so I would joke. I was trying to like joke. And I was like, Lisa. That was the only picture that my favorite was a donut. I'm not going to speak. That thing is scary. That thing is scary.
Okay, so all of you with computers, please go to the wiki. Okay, under handouts, activities, classroom, there should be a file that says K lecture evidence. Do people see that?
Yeah.
Handouts, activities, classroom.
What's the name of the file?
The file is K lecture evidence, oceans. People see that?
Oh yeah.
Refresh if it should be available. Download that file and have it open, please. Okay. Everybody all set? We have that? Raise your hand if you do not. If you do not yet have it downloaded.
It's not completely downloaded.
Yeah, it's not downloaded yet.
Okay. I'll try to read portions of the evidence as well, just so that people are sticking with me. All set? No, it's okay.
You can start.
Okay. I'm gonna get moving. So, I'm here to talk to you about critiques. Okay? I'm speaking to a broad audience, obviously, in terms of experience level, right? Some of you, this is your first real week of intense debate knowledge. So I'm going to try and start relatively slowly. Okay? We'll see where we end up. If there is a basic piece of information, a word, some vocabulary that I'm using that just seems not at all clear to you, and you really, you sort of need to stop and clarify, raise your hand. Okay, I will attempt to call and take questions as much as I can within the flow of the lecture. Okay, so I want to start with the general features, the sort of basic components of a critique. Okay, how they work, what they are, why they're a different argument from a bunch of the other arguments that we have. Okay, I'll go through that, and I want to work through those pieces. I'm going to do that more in a general theoretical sense first. Okay, so roughly the first hour or so that you're here, we're going to be talking about the general structure of a critique. Okay, hour number 2, we'll see how this first section goes, how quickly we get through it. In that second hour, I'm going to try and walk you through the critique that was produced for this camp. Okay, we'll sort of walk through the 1NC, talk through the different parts so that hopefully you'll have a good basis for understanding it to discuss in lab and then also to use at the tournament. Okay? So, first, parts of a critique. Parts of a critique. A link. An impact. A reason to evaluate the debate differently. Okay, this is a category that's got a longer name, okay? But think of it as a reason to evaluate the debate differently. And an alternative. Link, impact, reason to evaluate the debate differently, alternative. These are sort of the most basic components of most critique 1NCs. We'll talk through each of these parts and why they exist. But first, what's not on that list? Uniqueness. Okay? Uniqueness is not on that list. This is the crucial difference between most of the critiques that you will hear and debate and the disadvantages that you're likely more familiar with. Okay? And I want to go over this reason a little bit to understand what critiques bring to the strategic table that is different from a disadvantage. Okay? A disadvantage is a plan-focused argument. Disadvantage is a plan-focused argument. Right? We establish uniqueness as a way of demonstrating that our disadvantage, okay, the negative impact that's caused, is caused only by the plan. Right? It is unique. Only if the plan occurs will that negative consequence occur. Right? That's why we have the tool of uniqueness. Plan-focused. Right? A critique, okay, it's focused on the implementation of the plan. A critique, I would say, is focused on the 1AC rather than the plan. Okay? 1AC, not the plan. That doesn't mean that you don't have arguments about the plan. Right? There will be components of your critique that relate to the affirmative plan. But that's not you are changing the focus of the debate in the sense that it is not only about the plan anymore. It is now about the way in which the 1AC is put together. All right. My simplest definition that I have for a critique, definition I think you want to write down, is that it is an argument that criticizes the assumptions, methods, and or values that make an affirmative appear desirable. Okay? Yep. An argument that criticizes the assumptions, methods, and or values that make an affirmative appear desirable. Now, if we're not focused on the plan, but instead on the 1AC, I want to talk through a little bit what that means, okay, in terms of the way that it changes the debate. And I'm going to call on one of the sort of foremost authors that we use in debate for this type of argument, a French philosopher named Michel Foucault. Okay, you may have heard that name before. Foucault, okay, spelled Foucault. Okay. Not Fuko, the way that I first thought when I heard it in high school. Okay. This is the first card, that evidence that I asked you to download from the wiki. Okay, pull up that document right now. Everybody see this? You should be looking at a card. It doesn't have a tag. But it does have a site. It starts off with the site Foucault in 81. Everybody looking at that card? I'll see that? Okay. He's going to have a definition of critique, okay, or criticism in here that we'll use as a way to talk through some of the strategic implications. Okay, I've highlighted it, but we'll read along just to get a sense of this definition. An opposition can be made between critique and transformation. Okay, so critique, transformation. A critique is not a matter of saying that things are not right as they are. Okay? It is a matter of pointing out on what kinds of assumptions, what kinds of familiar, unchallenged, unconsidered modes of thought that the practices we accept rest. Criticism is a matter of flushing out that thought, trying to change it, to show that things are not as self-evident as one believed, to see that what is accepted as self-evident will no longer be accepted as such. Practicing criticism is a matter of making facile gestures difficult. Criticism is indispensable for any transformation, a transformation that remains within the same mode of thought, a transformation that is only a way of adjusting the same thought more closely to the reality of things, can merely be a superficial transformation. As soon as one can no longer think as one formerly thought, then, transformation becomes possible. So, let's talk through this a little bit. I think the distinction that Foucault is drawing here between transformation and critique is a good way to think about the difference between what the affirmative does in relationship to the status quo versus what a criticism does in relationship to the status quo. The affirmative is a transformation, right? It does make a change. It transforms the world. We want to enact the plan to change the way that the world looks, to change the policy in the area of, for this year, ocean policy, right? It's a transformation. But for the most part, right, those policies or those plans that we debate with regards to ocean policy, I think probably don't meet the threshold that Foucault is establishing for a critique. That is, they're a transformation, but they're not a critique because they rely on what? According to this paragraph that we just read. What do they rely on? The same mode of thinking. Okay, same modes of thought, right? The same approach. Okay? So it takes those modes that we encounter the world with, like the way that we understand how things work, how they operate, and as this evidence describes, adjusts them, right? It's like we have a reality. We have a reality. Think of the 1AC, the offshore wind 1AC that all of you are familiar with now, right? Okay, the packet that you've been working with. That 1AC says, well, our current way of approaching oceans policy isn't sufficient because it doesn't account for the environmental damage that climate change will cause. So we need to adjust that policy so that we develop wind energy to stop climate change, right? Has a mode of thought been transformed or changed in that process? Is there anything about the 1AC that says we need to change our whole way of approaching this question of ocean policy? No, right? It says basically the set of goals that we have are incorrect and they need to be adjusted, right? We need to adjust ocean policy in order to make sure that it helps us resolve climate change instead of making it worse. But there isn't really any critique or any encounter with some of the deeper ways of thinking or encountering the world, okay, that make those problems appear. That's the difference then between a critique that we run on the negative versus a transformation that we might make on the affirmative, right? This is a way of accounting for the fact that despite the fact that the affirmative changes things, okay, that is, they say the status quo is insufficient, they aren't necessarily a very deep criticism of that status quo, right? So we're thinking about transforming modes of thinking. Okay, that word, a couple words in here, a couple phrases that he uses that I want to get you thinking about. What does it mean for something to be self-evident? When he uses that phrase, self-evident, what does self-evident mean?
It's kind of taken for granted, like we're sure you know, like it's quite obvious.
Yeah, right? It's obvious. It's taken for granted is a really good way of translating that phrase. Okay, it's something that we take for granted. We just think, okay, that's the way things are, and that's the way they're going to be, right? It is self-evidently the case. Okay? Can anybody think of something that the offshore wind 1AC takes as self-evident?
The development, any development of the ocean is good.
I'm not sure that the 1AC says that any development of the ocean is good.
Develop the oceans.
Yeah, it does. It does definitely say that development is good.
That capitalist growth is good.
Yeah. Okay. We're working in some, critiques of capitalism already. You're sort of jumping ahead. I like that, but I think that there's maybe a little bit more fundamental of an assumption that is built into that notion of growth.
Extinction is bad.
Yeah. Okay. Tell you what, I'll fill this one in because it's close to what you had in the back there. Okay. One of the things that it takes as self-evident or takes for granted, okay, is that energy use / growth. Okay. So like you were saying, growth and development, that those will occur no matter what. Right. Energy use is increasing. We need to replace that energy with offshore wind. Right. In order that our energy production has fewer emissions, is less likely to cause climate change. It takes then as self-evident, right, the notion that growth will continue. Maybe your answer was closer than I gave you credit for. That's pretty good. I just sort of got annoyed that you threw in capitalism there already, but that's good, okay? It takes for granted, or as self-evident the assumption that growth will continue. Right? So, a major difference between critiques and other negative arguments, okay, that gets at this difference, that derives from this difference between transformation and critique. Okay? They don't compare, at the end of a debate where you're going for a critique, they don't compare the desirability of the plan to a stable status quo or a competitive policy option. Okay, so when we think of a debate that includes a disadvantage and or a counterplan, okay, we think about weighing the costs and the benefits of the plan, right, versus the status quo, so things stay the same, or a competitive policy option, a counterplan, right? The critique does not do that. Okay? Critique does not do that. We're not comparing to a stable status quo. Okay? Instead, we're going to criticize, okay, how the affirmative or how the 1AC is constructed, how it's put together. The choices that went into making that 1AC the way that it was. Okay, so we're not comparing to status quo. We are instead, and this is what it, here we get to the difference between transformation and critique, right? A transformation says we're going to make an adjustment. Critique, change our mode of thinking. So instead of comparing to status quo or things as they are, right? We're going to compare that the choices that the 1AC made to some other possible way of thinking or approaching the problem area that we're talking about. Okay, to some other mode of thinking, some other approach. Right? That was in that Foucault card. We're transforming the mode of thinking, the mode of approaching a problem. So, in that way, right, the way that the affirmative chooses to put together the 1AC, the choices that it makes, right, the assumptions that it builds in, if we say we need to examine these from another way of thinking or another mode of thinking, that's our basis for comparison. Not the status quo, not a different policy, a whole different way of approaching or thinking about the issue at hand. See how that works? All right. I want you to look at the second card that's included in the document that I sent out.
Is her name Coulet?
Cutler.
Oh, it's not French.
Not French. Claire Cutler, 2K. Okay. Everybody have that in front of them? Good? Okay. I'm starting with the underlined portion. Problem-solving theory. Problem-solving theory. And brief heads up first. We're going to be reading a fair amount of evidence here, or at least, a few cards. Definitely very dense evidence. Oftentimes, okay, and this is sort of the process that we'll use for working through this. One of the things that's daunting about encountering this type of argument, okay, so you're hearing about these critiques. It's like, sometimes thing that's tough is you're encountering a lot of new vocabulary, okay, or just ways of constructing an argument that you might not be familiar with at all. Best way to deal with that: break the evidence down word by word, phrase by phrase. Okay, try and unpack it. Okay, so don't read it so quickly. We'll think together about some of the definitions. So, problem-solving theory. This is about to be a definition. Problem-solving theory takes the world as it finds it. Okay, with the prevailing social and power relationships and the institutions into which they are organized as the given framework for action. Okay, problem-solving theory takes the world as it is, right? Prevailing social and power relationships and institutions as the given framework for action. What's an example of problem-solving theory in debate? What takes the set of institutions and issues that we have and sort of works within them?
The plan.
Yeah, right? The plan, or the affirmative, generally is engaged in a form of problem solving, right? Think back to the basic building blocks of debate. A harm, right? A problem. Solvency, a way to solve it. A solution. Okay, so problem solving theory. So the reason I'm having you read this evidence and to think about it is we're getting once again at the difference between an affirmative that says we have to change things versus a criticism. Okay, so problem-solving theory, for us, that's basically the role of the affirmative. It is instrumental in its goal of improving the workings of institutions, but does not call into question the patterns or purposes of those institutions and relations. What does instrumental mean there? So it's instrumental in its workings. What does it mean for something to be an instrument?
It's required in this.
Yeah, you might need an instrument, but I think actually an instrument is usually something that helps out, right? Rather than, oh, I need this. So it's instrumental in its goal. What does that mean? Yeah.
Very helpful. Very.
It's helpful. Yeah. We're getting there. Getting close. Yeah.
Sort of works well with everything around it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Helpful, works well.
It's a tool.
Yeah, it's a tool, right? Instrument. So it's instrumental. It's like we're going to use and apply the tools that we have, the institutions that we have, like the federal government, right? Or, think of the solvency evidence in that offshore wind one I see, right? The way in which the Department of Interior and the EPA, they have the ability to issue license for offshore wind power plants. They're just not doing it. Okay, it's instrumental in terms of improving those institutions. We want them to work a little bit better. They ought to issue these licenses. Okay, so it's instrumental. Critical theory, right? So once again, we have this sort of, right, definition opposite. Critical theory stands apart from the prevailing order of the world and asks how that order came about. Critical theory does not take institutions and social power relations for granted, but calls them into question. It is directed towards an appraisal of the very framework for action. What does appraisal mean? Anybody know? Yeah.
It's like it like sees how it evaluates it.
Yeah, it's an evaluation. Okay, it's an evaluation. So it evaluates, right, or is an appraisal of the very framework for action, which problem-solving theory accepts as its parameters. Theory is always for someone and some purpose. All theories, either explicitly or implicitly, embrace values and promote purposes and instruments. And the goal of critical theory is to lay these bare in order to allow for a normative choice in favor of a social and political order different from the prevailing order. What does a normative choice mean there? It's a normative choice.
I'm guessing more of a personal choice or something which a choice you would make just because it's a norm, a choice you would make truly because you think that's what it should be like.
You're very, very close, right? It is about making an assessment of what you might like as an ideal, right? Rather than just taking for granted. Somebody else had their hand raised. Yeah.
Relating to the normal.
Okay.
Standard.
Or a norm or a standard, right? A normative choice, to make a choice about norms. Okay, so we have the existing order, right? Existing way that things are set up. Institutions, the way that we define problems, the sort of range of possible solutions, right? We have that. That's the prevailing order, okay? And our role as somebody practicing critical theory, okay? Practicing critical theory is to step away from that as the parameter for action, okay? Those of you who have been listening to Will and I talk about debate history, okay, where did that word parameter show up? Anybody remember? Debate parameters or debate parametrics? Anybody remember? Okay, where did it show up? Topicality is one example. It establishes a parameter for debate. Okay, the plan. The plan is also an example. The AF used to defend the whole resolution. Okay, we had debates about the whole resolution. We moved to a plan-focused model of debate, where the affirmative chooses the ground, the portion of the resolution that they're defending. They establish a parameter. Okay? The reason I like this phrasing is that it illustrates that critiques are one way of challenging that notion of plan focus or of establishing a particular parameter for debate. Right? Our job is to bring back in all of those questions that the affirmative avoided or sort of left unasked. Right? There's a lot of questions. The affirmative answers one type of question. Right? It outlines a problem, answer, solution. Right? One type of question. There are lots of other possible questions that we might ask that the affirmative tends to avoid. Okay? Thinking back to that Foucault card and the phrase in that Foucault card, anybody remember that phrase, making facile gestures difficult? Goal of criticism, make facile gestures difficult. What does facile mean? Easy, right? Okay. His point, and the point that animates critique debating in general, is that very often within an existing mode of thinking or an existing way of approaching a problem, we have a very easy set of answers. Okay, it's the type of they are the type of answers that we are very familiar with, right? If you go home, you talk to your parents a little bit about offshore wind, and we want to produce power a little bit differently, helps us stop climate change, right? Chances are that's a description or sort of a way of describing both a problem and a solution that you're going to be able to have a conversation about it without talking through a lot of other assumptions that you're making, right? It's like it occurs in the realm of what we generally take as the way that Foucault evidence described self-evident. Okay, self-evident. So, if we're no longer working in the realm of the self-evident, and we're also not working with something that is unique to the plan, okay, we're now getting to a link section. First argument, we've got to find a link. That changes what a link is. Changes what a link is. Right? Normally, what does a link indicate?
Something.
You've sort of been talking a lot. I kind of want to hear from somebody else. Somebody who hasn't said something yet, raise their hand. What's a link? What's a link to?
How the plan causes whatever it causes, so this ad or the whatever the plan causes.
The most important phrase there is it's a cause. It's a causal argument, right? A causes B. That's our link argument, right? This will happen because of this. Okay. My suggestion to you is that in the case of critique debating, links, you want to think of them more as examples, right? If we're criticizing the way that we usually think about a whole set of problems, right? Something that's considered self-evident, okay, or the given, right? Taking things for granted, that definition that we had over there from the audience was pretty good, right? If we're questioning the way that things generally are taken for granted, right? Our link arguments aren't the plan causes us to think about the world in this way, because we already do, right? If we're making a criticism of development or a criticism of capitalism, right? A criticism of technology or technological approaches to the world, right? The whole point of our argument is that basically this is the way that most of us already think about this problem. So the link argument it's not a causal argument, right? It's not A causes B, right? Whether or not we do offshore wind development, right, according to one of the critiques that we'll talk through, the critique that's been produced here, we will still tend to think about the oceans or ocean policy in terms of economic development, right? Offshore wind is one possible example of that, but it's not as though if the federal government doesn't develop offshore wind that suddenly no one will think about the ocean as a resource, right? You see what I mean? It's sort of the opposite. It's like, oh, we already tend to think of the oceans in this way, right? A place to go get fish, right? A place for people to use for recreation or entertainment, right? Thinking about the ocean as a resource or something to be developed, that's going to happen regardless of the plan, okay? So our link arguments are about the ways in which the 1AC, okay, has examples of the mode of thought or the way of approaching the world that we're trying to criticize. Okay? Right? We said that we're criticizing assumptions. So we need to point out with our link arguments, here is where this assumption appears in the 1AC. Here's where they built in this assumption. Here's this thing that they took for granted. See how that's a very different way of thinking about a link argument? Right? Not a cause. Instead, much more about these are the choices that the 1AC made that reveal that they are still part of this mode of thinking that we're criticizing. This means also, okay, that the way that you debate link arguments has to change. Usually, we're used to explaining link arguments because A causes B, right? We just say, well, when the plan happens, here's our link argument, our explanation for what happens as a result. Instead, though we read evidence, okay, you will read link evidence, obviously, I guess. You'll read a link evidence or a link card. Okay, let's say our link card in this case is something like, we tend to approach the ocean through the lens of economic development. Very broad link claim. Okay, and we read a card that says, here are all of the ways that we tend to approach the problems of ocean policy through the lens of promoting more growth through development. Okay, and that's what our link card says. It's a description of sort of the mode of thinking, the way that we approach the problem. Our job in debating these link arguments in the 2NC, okay, is instead of reading more evidence that just describes again and again this sort of mode of thinking, you want to get at the parts of the 1AC that exemplify or prove, right, that this is the way the affirmative approached the issue. Okay, so we're getting at link arguments as examples. It also changes the way that we try and explain which link arguments are important. Okay? Usually, if we're thinking about links as causes or as causal arguments, right? A causes B. The way that we evaluate the weight of a link argument is through the degree of certainty that we have that A causes B. Right? So the negative, in their disadvantage, the negative reads a link card, right? Let's say for one of the has every lab talked about the, the electricity prices disadvantage? Has every lab talked about that disadvantage? Yes. Okay. Right? The strength of that link argument is going to be about how much or how certain we are that offshore wind development raises electricity prices, right? The affirmative could read a defensive card that says, no, they won't raise electricity prices that much, right? Therefore, we should be far less certain that that would happen, right? We're arguing over whether or not B results from A. Okay? Instead of that, since we're not talking about causes anymore, I think the way that you want to make your link arguments important, okay, or to have weight, right, is to demonstrate that the examples that you've chosen prove that the assumption or the method or the value, right, going back to the definition, assumption, method, or value that you're criticizing is very important for the 1AC. Yeah. The way that you give your link arguments weight, right, and the way you make them important is to demonstrate that the assumption or the value or the method that you're criticizing, when you choose examples from the 1AC, you try and choose examples that illustrate that that assumption is very important, right? If we take away this assumption, or if we stop believing, right, in the mode of thinking, if we stop believing that the world works this way, okay, it would mean that the AF doesn't really make much sense anymore, right? That's, if you demonstrating an assumption is really important, right, means that if you were to take that assumption away, a bunch of other stuff falls apart, right? It's like that's what we tend to think of as assumptions, right? A foundation or like a basis for making an argument or a judgment. And if those foundations give away, right, suddenly a whole bunch of other pieces fall apart too. So we want to illustrate the way that we make our link arguments important. 2NC, when you get to illustrating examples from the text of the 1AC, it's all ways of demonstrating that the 1AC really relies very strongly on this assumption or this mode of thought that you're criticizing. Do people see how that's a different way of approaching link arguments? Is the difference clear? Do we need to spend some time clarifying that? Example instead of cause. Okay. So we're criticizing a mode of thinking or a way of approaching. Okay. Second argument. Although I can't remember if I listed impact second, but I want to talk now about the section of arguments, and this is really the most complicated, okay, or the most complex, the thing that is most different with regards to critiques versus other arguments. Okay, and that is a reason that we should evaluate the debate differently. this type of argument has a bunch of different names. And this is where we get into some confusing terminology. Okay. Some people like to call this type of argument a framework argument. Okay. Oftentimes, back many years ago, it was referred to as an argument about why your critique was a prior issue. Okay, critique as a prior issue. Or sometimes, and this doesn't even cover all of the possibilities, but I want to go into discussing some of them first. Or you could say that your argument is a discursive or representational critique. The names are different. The strategic purpose, very similar. Okay, we're going to be talking primarily about that strategic purpose, and I'll try and give some examples using the different terminology. Okay. Another way to think of this section of arguments is if our link arguments are just examples. If our link arguments are just examples, why do they matter? Okay. This section is a way of making them matter. Okay, this section is a way of making them matter. Right? Because our impact arguments don't have uniqueness. See how that works? Right? Usually, right, the impact is only going to occur as a result of a plan. That's what we're trying to argue with a disadvantage. Only as a result of the plan. Right? So it has uniqueness. You don't need to worry about trying to make your link arguments important in any way other than to say, well, they have this impact. Right? It would cause this bad thing to happen, or it would cause this good thing to happen. Right? But here, since the impact arguments and the link arguments that we're talking about don't have uniqueness, we need some other way to make them important. See how that works? This is the way of making them important. So, first I'll go through the sort of language of critique as a prior issue. Okay, because this is in debate terms, I would say that this is an older way of explaining it, but it doesn't mean it's a bad one. Prior means before, right? Before. Very simple. We got that one. Prior. It's before it. Okay? So if it's a prior issue, right, that means that we're essentially saying the problems that we've identified with the 1AC, with its mode of thinking, right, to go back to that Foucault card, or the way in which it is a form of problem-solving theory, the way that it attempts to solve problems using that Cutler card. Okay, we're going to illustrate in either way, right, that those problems that we've identified need to be addressed before other issues can be decided. Before anything else can be decided, we need to debate and decide these issues, these prior issues, these assumptions that are built in to the 1AC. Right? That is, the way the affirmative suggests resolving the debate cannot take place, or should not take place, until the set of assumptions used in the 1AC are tested. Yeah. Okay. The way the affirmative suggests resolving the debate, okay, cannot or should not take place until the set of assumptions used in the 1AC are tested. Okay, an example that draws a little bit on the critique that was produced for this camp, so I'm sort of setting up part 2 of the lecture by using some of the examples that are connected to a position that you'll have. Okay, let's say you were debating a seabed mining affirmative. Okay, we got to go out and mine the deep seabed for a variety of metals and other resources. Okay, right. We could say, if our critique is a prior issue, our critique of developing the oceans is a prior issue, that before we decide whether or not the U.S. is the right country to start mining, whether or not mining is actually beneficial for the U.S. economy or the global economy, we have to decide whether the assumption that economic development is an acceptable goal in policymaking or an acceptable value in policymaking. Okay, we have to decide that question first. Okay. Right? The causal claims, the problem-solving claims that the AF makes, okay, we solve this problem by increasing development that improves the U.S. economy or the global economy, right? It's like, before we get into the details of that way of solving the problem, we have to test the assumption that economic growth or economic development are good goals and values for making policy decisions. It's a prior issue, right? So you've identified this way of solving this problem. Rather than deal entirely with the sort of level of implementation or the way that you solve that problem, we got to examine what you took for granted was a problem and was a solution to begin with. Yeah.
So is it kind of like you're saying we need to test the assumption that the problem is really a problem?
Yeah, that is likely built into it. Okay, that's likely built into it because, okay, when we get back to that idea of a mode of thinking, right, that quote from Foucault, a mode of thinking, if you think about it, a mode of thinking is something that we use to identify both problems and solutions, right? It's like built into a worldview or a mode of thinking, we tend to be able to identify both a problem and a solution within that same mode. Okay? They fit together. Okay? Right? To use the example of offshore wind again, okay, in that taken for granted assumption that, we need to produce more energy. Okay? It's like our energy usage will increase or will stay the same. We've got to produce a different type of energy, right? Rather than, for example, the assumption that perhaps we should attempt to decrease consumption, right? Those are two different modes of approaching the problem. One says growth is a fact of life. We take for granted our economy is built on growth, right? Problem. Our growth is not environmentally sustainable. Solution. Make growth environmentally sustainable. That's all within one mode of thought, right? There's a general approach and a value structure that underlies what we identify as a problem and, as a result, the possible range of solutions. Okay? If we are criticizing that whole mode of thought, right, the whole way of approaching it, most often that will involve redefining both the set of problems that we face and the range of possible solutions. So you're challenging all of that at once. And that's, yes, so that gets at why it can be referred to as a prior issue, right? It's like, within this bubble, within this way of thinking about the world, sure, that might make sense. Okay, fine. We get it. If the world works the way that you say that it does, that your 1AC might be a fine idea. But we don't think that mode or that way of approaching the area is okay, so we will challenge that first. Okay, and all the little details that you've worked out within your mode of thinking, those could be all well and good, but we actually think that you're wrong about the way that things work in general. We have a different theory about how the world works, or a different theory of what is a problem. Okay? Yeah.
Is that all part of like the impact?
We'll get to the impact argument. Yeah, I mean, these arguments are a little bit more difficult to separate here than they are on a disadvantage. Your question gets at that, but we'll talk about the impact in that. Okay. So, wording number 2, or sort of the second way of approaching this wording, same strategic purpose. Okay, referring to an argument as framework. Okay, we have a framework for the debate. Okay, when I hear the word framework, I think of like a scaffold. Okay, people know what that is, right? If you're building a building, right? The building that you walked by to get here, right? They're building that new building. So they have a bunch of scaffolding up, right? Stuff that holds everything into place while they build the building. Okay? It's a framework. It's a way to make sure that it doesn't all fall apart, right? In order to build this thing, we've got to have a built-in framework, a thing to make sure that it all stays together. Okay? All debates have a framework for making a decision. They all do. They all have a framework for making a decision. But we don't always talk about it. This is a nifty little example, actually, of that whole notion of a mode of thinking. Okay? When we teach you how to do policy debating, okay, or policy debate, right? That's a mode. It's a way of thinking about how we debate and what we should be debating, right? And the framework that we use for evaluating those debates usually just it's left unsaid. It's implicit. right? We have impact calculus arguments. Okay, we have tons of impact calculus arguments, right? This impact is larger than this impact is faster than this other one, right? We have all those ways of making impact calculus, but, right, the way that we're going to make that decision, so we consider the costs and benefits of a plan versus the status quo or a competitive policy option, right? That's usually implicit. If you go for a disadvantage and a counterplan, you don't have to spend all this time explaining, well, we've introduced a counterplan. That is a different solution to the same problem. It also has a net benefit. Here, I'll define what a net benefit is. If it is net beneficial, then you don't do that, right? You don't have to do that whole explanation because we have a terminology, a framework, right, that's built in so that you have debates about the impacts within that framework, but you don't usually have to do most of the work to explain why things work that way. See how that works, right? It's just like it's implicit, taken for granted, right? So when we change the framework for the debate, what we're really saying is that those assumptions that are usually made about how we evaluate the effects of the plan, whether or not the plan is the focus of the debate, all those things that are built into a model of policy making, right, which is a worldview, a mode of thinking, right? We're going to challenge or critique some of those. So in a policy-making framework, right, the judge focuses on evaluating the impacts of doing the plan versus not, or a competitive policy option. Right? Introducing a different framework for the debate means that you're challenging not just the claims made by the affirmative, but the whole scaffolding that holds those claims together. And I would say, oftentimes, the scaffolding that establishes the role that we occupy for the debate. Okay, so instead of approaching the topic area from the perspective of the policymaker, right, the judge could occupy an entirely different role. Right? The policymaker tends to approach the world as a problem solver, right? Like that Cutler evidence that we read before, right? Problem-solving theory, right? Here's a set of problems. Here's the set of policy tools that we have. We'll use that set of instruments to make the world a little bit better. Okay, instead of a problem solver, we will then redefine the problem. Redefine the role for the ballot. At the most abstract level, so the exact way of doing this, here is the different role for how you should evaluate the debate or how you should think about the world, right? There are a whole variety of different critiques that have different answers to that question or different ways of phrasing that answer. But I would say at the most abstract level, okay, instead of evaluating the effects of the plan, you are usually asking the judge to evaluate the effects of the affirmative advocacy. So, what does it mean to endorse the 1AC? The plan is a recommended course of action. The advocacy includes more, right? When we're talking about advocacy, it's not simply the plan, but also the reasons for doing the plan, right? Advocacy, I think we should do this because, right? If you're an advocate, you have a because. You got a reason, right? Not just a claim, not just an action, but a reason for pursuing that action. So it's the 1AC. This is why I suggested above that most often critiques change the focus of the debate from the plan, so plan-focused debating, to 1AC-focused debating. Okay. A couple different ways of thinking about this. This often involves saying, here's one, that the affirmative's impact is either... Not me. Okay, here we go. So, option one. This often involves saying that the affirmative's impact is either something that we should not evaluate, or that in order to weigh the affirmative's impact, we would have to make other unacceptable choices. or ethically unacceptable choices. Okay, so for example, okay, not drawn from the oceans here, but just I think an example that gets at this. We could have a debate about racial profiling as a policy for decreasing crime rates. Okay, we could have that debate. The neg could say racial profiling is ineffective at reducing crime. Right? That's one possible negative response. No, this tool does not achieve the ends that you want it to. Right? Alternatively, they could also say we should not consider the issue of the crime rate in this debate because racial profiling is racist. It doesn't matter whether or not it reduces crime. Right? You see how that changes the framework for the debate? Right? In one of these instances, we're talking about criminal justice policy in terms of what reduces the crime rate. Given a criticism of that whole set of tools, okay? It's like that set of tools is racist, it's unacceptable. Therefore, the impact on the crime rate and really thinking about this policy area, the choice about whether or not to racially profile in terms of the crime rate, it's unacceptable. Once you have made the decision to advocate racial profiling, okay, right, it's a criticism of that advocacy. We should do this because, right? See how that works? It changes the framework for the debate. The whole set of what we consider to be the problem that we're solving has changed. If the problem is the rate of crime reflected in a certain number of crime statistics versus racism, those are very different ways of conceiving what is the problem in this area, and also then what are the likely set of solutions. Right? Racial profiling might be a perfectly acceptable solution defined within a debate that is purely about the crime rate from a statistical perspective. Right? But you could be taking an objection to that whole worldview. Right? We could combine those arguments, or we could combine these two arguments. This is the second way of thinking about this. Both that we shouldn't consider the affirmative's impact and that trying to get us to care about the affirmative impact or advocate the affirmative impact is unacceptable. Okay. So, for example, okay, in the file that's produced for this camp, in the sort of oceans development critique, there are a number of cards that criticize development. Okay. Pro-growth or green technology, basically green technological solutions. Development strategies for dealing with environmental problems. They claim, these cards claim, both that, one, development strengthens inequalities, so it doesn't achieve its own stated goal. Right? The idea of development, sort of the rising tide lifts all boats, right? Everybody benefits, everybody wins from growth, right? This set of cards says both, it doesn't achieve that, so even within that worldview, it does not achieve its ends, it falls apart. Okay, it produces inequality, not equality. And two, that organizing international society according to development, okay, requires a hierarchy between good, developed countries and inadequate or bad, underdeveloped countries or developing countries, right? So even if development-oriented policies help produce more growth, they are unacceptable because they treat societies with different values as inferior. That's a way of combining those two arguments, right? Advocating for this policy on behalf of this set of values, so pro-growth or pro-development values, right? Both doesn't achieve the end that it's supposed to, and trying to get us to care about that end has this other negative set of effects, right? If you try to get us to endorse or care about the idea of development, or to think of the idea of development as an ideal, as a value that's worth making policy, right? It produces this hierarchy that is not acceptable, not morally acceptable. Okay. Last sort of phrase that I am going to discuss in terms of this reason to evaluate the debate differently section of your critique. Okay, and that's a discursive or representational critique. And I've saved this for last because this is the most complicated, but it's also the one that's going to give us, I think, some easy examples to work through. And you know what? You all have been listening for about an hour. Why don't we take a 5-minute break? Does that sound okay? Okay, we'll do a 5-minute break. Okay, so I'll go back over the heading. We'll be fine. 5-minute break.